Have you ever wondered what really happens in libraries after dark? Not the usual quiet of empty buildings, but something different, something wrong. I never believed the stories about haunted books or cursed collections. At least, not until I worked the night shift at Brighton Falls Public Library. What I found there changed everything I thought I knew about reality. And after you hear my story, you might never look at libraries the same way again. Hey horror fans, I know many of you use these videos to help you sleep. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying true story, drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from. I love seeing how our horror family spreads across the globe. And if you enjoy creepy library tales, hit that subscribe button. Now let's begin Sarah Mitchell's story. I never planned to work nights at Brighton Falls Library. Growing up in this small Massachusetts town, the library had been my escape from bullies and loneliness. The tall brick building with its green copper dome had always felt safe, familiar. But that changed the night I found the black leather book. Let me start from the beginning. I was fresh out of college, drowning in student debt, when Mr. Harrison, the head librarian, offered me a job. I'd practically lived in the library as a kid, so when he mentioned needing help with the night shift, I jumped at the chance. The pay was decent, and how hard could watching an empty library be? Just keep an eye on things, Mr. Harrison said, his weathered face serious as he handed me the keys. And Sarah, stay out of the rare books room after sunset. I laughed it off then. I mean, what could happen in a library at night? Books don't just get up and walk away, right? Wrong. So, very wrong. My first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. You know that feeling when a place you know well suddenly feels different? Like the shadows are a little deeper, the silence a little heavier? That's how the library felt after dark. The building was old, dating back to 1887. During the day, the high arched windows let in streams of golden light that made the oak shelves glow. But at night, those same windows turned into black mirrors, reflecting nothing but darkness. I tried to keep busy, restocking returns and organizing the children's section, but I kept getting drawn to the rare books room. It was tucked away in the basement, behind a heavy oak door with brass fittings. Mr. Harrison usually kept it locked, but one night I found it standing open. The air down there was different, colder, with a musty smell that reminded me of old paper and dried flowers. My flashlight beam caught rows of glass cases holding ancient-looking volumes. But what caught my eye was a black leather book lying on the center table. It wasn't in a case. It wasn't even properly shelved. It just sat there, as if waiting for someone to pick it up. The cover had no title, just intricate symbols tooled into the leather that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I know I should have left it alone. Everything about that book screamed wrong, but something pulled at me, like a hook behind my navel, drawing me closer until my fingers brushed the cover. The leather was warm. Books shouldn't be warm. I opened it anyway. The pages were thick parchment, covered in handwritten text that looked centuries old, but I could read it perfectly. Stories, dozens of them, but not ordinary fairy tales. These were different, darker, more real somehow. I flipped through until one caught my eye, The Night Librarian's Tale. The first line sent chills down my spine. They say every library has its own ghost, but what they don't tell you is that some books hunger for more than just readers. A loud crash from upstairs made me jump. The book slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dull thud that echoed strangely in the confined space. When I picked it up, the page I'd been reading was blank. Completely blank. My hands shook as I flipped through the book. Every page, blank, as if the words had simply vanished. Another crash from above, closer this time, then footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps that didn't sound quite human, too heavy, too wet. I switched off my flashlight, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice. the soft rustle of pages turning, but not from the book in my hands. This sound came from everywhere at once, like the whole library was suddenly alive with invisible readers. A whisper drifted down the stairs. "Sarah, we've been waiting for you." I recognized the voice. It was Mr. Harrison's, but wrong somehow, like his voice was being pushed through wet cloth. And he shouldn't have been there. He'd left hours ago. "You opened the book," not Harrison said. "Now you have to read the stories, all of them, just like I did, just like the others before me." The footsteps started again, coming down the basement stairs. I backed away, clutching the book. My flashlight beam caught something moving in the darkness, a figure that looked like Mr. Harrison, but stretched, too tall, too thin, with fingers that trailed on the ground like wet paper. "Give it time," the thing wearing Harrison's face said. "You'll learn to love the stories. They'll become part of you, just like they became part of me." Its mouth opened too wide, showing rows of teeth that looked like sharpened book pages. I ran, through the stacks, past towering shelves that seemed to lean inward, watching my escape. Books flew off the shelves behind me, their pages fluttering like angry wings. I could hear them whispering, thousands of voices speaking in languages I'd never heard before. I made it to the main floor, but the front doors wouldn't budge. The windows showed only darkness, not the streetlights and passing cars that should have been there, but complete, absolute darkness. "You can't leave," Harrison's voice echoed from everywhere. "The library has chosen you, just like it chose me 50 years ago." I spun around, and there he was at the top of the stairs. But it wasn't really him anymore. His skin had turned the color of old paper, and ink seemed to flow beneath it in strange patterns. His eyes were empty holes filled with tiny moving letters. What are you?" I managed to ask. He smiled, and his teeth were black with ink. "I'm the night librarian, or I was, but now it's your turn. The books need a new caretaker." I looked down at the black leather book in my hands. The symbols on the cover were definitely moving now, rearranging themselves into words I could almost read. "What happens if I refuse?" Harrison's laugh sounded like tearing paper. "Oh, Sarah, you already accepted when you opened the book. The stories are already becoming part of you. Haven't you noticed?" I had. My skin felt different, dry, papery, and when I spoke, I could taste ink in my mouth. "The transition is easier if you don't fight it," Harrison said, moving closer. His movements were jerky, like pages caught in the wind. "Soon you'll understand. The library isn't just a building, it's alive, and it feeds on stories. Our stories, human stories. It needs us to keep them alive." I backed away until I hit the circulation desk. "This can't be real. It's just a dream. I fell asleep on shift and—" "Look at your hands, Sarah." I did. Horror rose in my throat as I watched ink begin to seep from my pores, forming letters that crawled across my skin like insects. Stories. My stories. Every book I'd ever read, every tale I'd ever loved, bleeding out of me onto the surface of my skin. "The process has already started," Harrison said. His form was beginning to fade, becoming transparent like onion paper. "I've served my time. 50 years of feeding the library its stories. Now it's your turn." "No!" I tried to drop the book, but my fingers wouldn't let go. The leather seemed to have fused with my skin. "I don't want this!" None of us did, but the library chooses what it needs. His voice was growing fainter. "You'll learn to love it. The stories will keep you company, and in 50 years, you'll find someone else to take your place, just like I found you." I watched in horror as Harrison's body began to dissolve into fragments of paper that swirled in an invisible wind. His last words barely reached me. "Welcome to your new home, Night Librarian." That was 3 months ago. I'm still here, in Brighton Falls Library. I can't leave. I've tried. The building won't let me go further than the front steps. My skin is almost completely covered in text now, and sometimes I catch myself shedding paper instead of dead skin cells. The stories in the black book are part of me. I can feel them squirming under my skin, waiting to be read. And every night, someone new comes to the library. They're drawn to the rare books room, to the black leather book that always seems to find its way onto that center table. I watch them from the shadows, my paper white fingers trailing ink as I move. I want to warn them. I want to tell them to run, to never open that book. But I can't. The library won't let me. All I can do is watch as another curious reader finds the book, opens it, and begins the cycle again. So next time you're in a library after dark, pay attention to the shadows between the shelves. Listen for the whisper of pages turning when no one's there. And if you see a librarian with paper white skin and ink-stained hands, run. Because the stories aren't just on the pages anymore. They're alive, they're hungry, and they're always looking for new readers to feed on. Some say they've seen me in other libraries now. My story seems to have spread, infecting other collections, other buildings. The Black Book appears where it wants to, calling to those who love stories too much for their own good. Maybe you've seen it? That leather-bound volume sitting alone on a table, waiting to be opened? If you have, don't touch it. Don't read it. Because once you do, you'll become part of the story too. And the library always needs new stories. I have to go now. I can feel the ink rising beneath my skin, the stories pushing to get out. And I think I hear footsteps coming down to the rare books room. Another reader, another potential night librarian. The cycle continues. But that's not where my story ends. The library had more horrifying secrets to reveal, and each night brought new terrors that tested my sanity. One night, about a week after my transformation began, I discovered something in the library's old card catalog, a drawer that hadn't been there before. Inside were hundreds of yellowed cards, each one bearing a name and date. As I read them, I realized they were records of previous night librarians, stretching back centuries. Thomas Wheeler, 1887 to 1937. Margaret Kane, 1937 to 1987. James Harrison, 1987 to 2024. Sarah Mitchell, 2024. The dates showed 50 years exactly for each librarian, but what caught my eye were the notes scribbled on the backs of the cards. They told stories of their own, dark tales of what happened to those who tried to break free from the library's curse. Thomas Wheeler tried to burn the building down in 1890. The fire refused to spread, and the next day, patrons found him sealed inside the walls, his body transformed into bound volumes that told his life story over and over. Margaret Kane attempted to destroy the Black Book in 1943. She took it to a steel mill and threw it into the molten metal. But when she returned to the library, the book was waiting on her desk, and her hands had turned to paper that wrote out her failure endlessly. James Harrison, my predecessor, he had tried something different. He'd searched for a way to transfer the curse without waiting the full 50 years. That's why he hired me. He'd found a loophole, but the price was steep. His soul would be trapped in the library forever, bound to the building as a warning to future night librarians. I hear him sometimes, whispering between the shelves. His voice carries fragments of stories that were never meant to be read. The worst part? The patrons who visit during the day can't see what the library really looks like now. They don't notice how the shelves pulse like breathing lungs, or how shadows write themselves on the walls in ancient languages. They can't see how my skin glows with phosphorescent ink, or how books follow them through the aisles like hungry pets. But children, they can see. I've watched them point at things their parents can't perceive, their eyes wide with a mixture of wonder and fear. Some of them can even see me for what I really am, though most just think I'm wearing a costume. There was one little girl, Emma, who started coming to the library every afternoon. She would sit in the children's section and stare at me while I reshelved books, fascinated by the way words crawled across my skin. "You're made of stories," she said one day, her voice full of innocent curiosity. I tried to warn her away, but the library's power prevented me from speaking directly about the curse. Instead, I could only watch as she became more and more drawn to the rare books room. One evening, just before closing, I found her standing at the top of the basement stairs, looking down into the darkness. "The books are calling me," she said. "They want to tell me their secrets." I managed to stop her that time, but she kept coming back. The library had marked her as a potential future night librarian. I could see it in the way the shadows reached for her, how the books seemed to glow faintly when she passed. That's another part of my curse. I have to watch as the library stalks its future victims, unable to intervene. The most I can do is try to guide them toward lighter reading, away from the darker corners where the hungry books wait. But the library always finds a way. Last week, a college student came in looking for books on local history. The black book appeared on a shelf right in front of him, though I know it had been locked in my office moments before. I watched in horror as he reached for it, his fingers inches from the leather binding. Just before he touched it, the lights flickered, and I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing behind him was a figure made entirely of torn pages and running ink, another former night librarian, reaching out with paper hands to welcome a new member to our cursed fellowship. I knocked over a cart of books, startling him away from the shelf. The paper figure turned its head toward me, empty eye sockets weeping black ink, and I knew I'd pay for that interference. That night, the library punished me. The stories under my skin began to burn, each word feeling like it was being carved into me with a hot needle. The books on the shelves screamed with voices that sounded almost human, and James Harrison's spirit tormented me with visions of all the previous night librarians who had tried to fight the curse. I saw them all, their transformations, their desperate attempts to escape, their final surrender to the library's power. Some had gone mad, living out their 50 years in a haze of whispered stories and midnight terrors. Others had embraced the curse, actively seeking out new victims to feed the library's hunger. The visions showed me something else too. What happens to night librarians who serve their full term? They don't just fade away like James Harrison appeared to do. They become part of the library itself, their consciousness absorbed into its walls, their memories bound into its foundation. Every brick, every floorboard contains the essence of a former librarian. That's why the building feels alive. It is alive, powered by the souls of hundreds of storytellers trapped within its structure. I've started to notice changes in myself beyond the physical transformation. I can read books without opening them now, absorbing their contents just by touching their spines. Words appear in my mind unbidden, telling stories I've never heard before. Sometimes I catch myself speaking in languages that haven't been spoken in centuries. The worst moments are when I feel the library's hunger as my own. I find myself watching patrons with an unnatural interest, evaluating their potential as future night librarians. I can sense their love of stories, their susceptibility to the curse. The stronger their passion for books, the more appealing they appear to my altered senses. Last night, something unprecedented happened. A woman came into the library after hours, a paranormal investigator who had heard rumors about the building's strange history. She carried cameras and EMF meters, talking excitedly about cold spots and unusual energy readings. The library let her in, though I always locked the doors. I think it was curious about her equipment, wondering if modern technology could capture its true nature. I watched from the shadows as she set up her cameras. The library watched too, its awareness focused on her every movement. The books stirred restlessly on their shelves, their pages rustling with anticipation. When she reached the rare books room, her equipment went haywire. The cameras filled with static, the EMF meters screamed, and every device she carried suddenly died. In the silence that followed, I heard the black book call to her. She found it exactly where I knew she would, on the center table, open to a story about a curious investigator who discovered too much. I couldn't stop her from reading it. None of us could. The transformation was different this time. Instead of becoming a night librarian, she became part of her own story. I watched as her body transformed into pure energy, absorbed into her camera's memory card. Now she exists as digital data, her consciousness trapped in electronic form, endlessly recording the library's horrors without being able to share them with the outside world. Her equipment remains in the rare books room, a warning to others who might try to document the library's mysteries. Sometimes, late at night, her cameras turn on by themselves, recording static-filled footage of things that shouldn't exist. This incident taught me that the library is evolving, finding new ways to trap souls and store stories. It's adapting to the digital age while keeping its ancient power intact. I wonder what other forms the curse might take as technology advances. Will there be night librarians for electronic books? Digital storytellers trapped in computer networks? The thought keeps me awake during the long nights, as I wander the aisles in my transformed state. My fingers leave trails of luminous ink on everything I touch, writing fragments of stories that fade by morning. The library has become my entire world, its boundaries both my prison and my domain. I've started keeping my own record, adding to the collection of night librarian tales. My words appear in blank books throughout the library, describing my experiences, my transformation, my gradual acceptance of what I've become. Future night librarians will read my story, just as I read the accounts of those who came before me. But there's something else, something I haven't told anyone until now. In my research through the library's hidden archives, I've found hints of a possible escape. Ancient texts mention a ritual that could break the curse, but the price is unimaginable. It would require sacrificing every story ever absorbed by the library, releasing not just the night librarians, but every tale ever told within these walls. The world would lose countless stories, and those of us trapped here might lose ourselves entirely. Is freedom worth such a cost? Would I still be me without the stories that have become literally part of my being? I don't know if I'll ever find the courage to try. For now, I continue my nightly rounds, watching over the library's collection, guiding day readers away from its darker temptations when I can. I feel the weight of centuries of stories pressing down on me, and I wonder how many more tales will be added before my 50 years are complete. To those who might read this, consider it both a confession and a warning. The library is always hunting, always hungry for new stories and new storytellers. It might be watching you right now, evaluating your potential, waiting for the perfect moment to offer you its cursed gift. If you love books, if stories speak to your soul, be careful where you read. Some libraries are more than just buildings. Some books are more than just paper and ink. And some tales, once started, can never be unread. The sun is rising now, and I feel the daily change beginning. My ink-stained skin will fade to a more human appearance. My paper-white hair will darken, and I'll pretend to be a normal librarian for another day. But as you walk through your local library's aisles, remember my story. Remember that between the mundane rows of books, ancient powers still lurk. The black leather book is out there, moving from library to library, seeking its next keeper. And somewhere, a night librarian is watching, their skin crawling with living words, waiting to welcome another member to our cursed fellowship. Will you be next? Only the library knows for sure. The incident with the paranormal investigator changed something in the library, or maybe it changed something in me. The air grew thicker with possibility, heavy with the weight of untold stories. I began noticing details I'd missed before, hidden symbols carved into the wooden shelves, patterns in the carpet that shifted when watched too long, and whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The more I learned about the library's history, the more I understood why it had chosen me. In the weeks following the paranormal investigator's disappearance, I discovered a hidden room behind the reference section. The entrance only appeared at exactly 3:33 a.m., revealed by moonlight striking a particular angle of the shelves. Inside, I found journals, hundreds of them, each written by a different night librarian. As I read them, I began to see a pattern. We were all the same, lonely children who found refuge in books, who felt more at home among stories than people. The library didn't just pick random book lovers. It chose the ones who were already half in love with the idea of becoming part of a story themselves. Reading those journals, I remembered things from my childhood that I'd forgotten. Like the time I hid from bullies in the library's mystery section, and the books seemed to rearrange themselves to conceal me. Or the day I fell asleep reading in a corner, and woke up with words temporarily tattooed on my skin, a preview of what I would become. The library had been grooming me for decades. One journal entry particularly caught my attention. It was written by Elizabeth Blackwood, night librarian from 1837 to 1887. She described a ritual that could temporarily reveal the library's true form to normal visitors. I knew I shouldn't try it, but curiosity overwhelmed my caution. The ritual was simple. At midnight, arrange 7 specific books in a circle, each open to page 33. Place a mirror in the center. Light 3 black candles. Then read the first line from each book in sequence. I performed the ritual during my next night shift. What happened next still haunts me. The mirror's surface turned black as ink, then seemed to melt, spreading across the floor like an oil slick. The walls began to actually breathe, expanding and contracting like giant lungs. And the books, God, the books. They transformed into something organic. The shelves became rib cages, the books pulsing organs pumping ink instead of blood. Pages rustled like thousands of paper wings, and stories leaked from between the covers like golden syrup, forming puddles that reflected impossible scenes. In those reflections, I saw every story ever read in the library playing out simultaneously. Fictional characters moved through their tales like actors in endless plays. But they weren't just characters anymore. They were conscious, aware, and they could see me watching them. A little girl from a fairy tale looked up and waved. A detective from a mystery novel tipped his hat. A monster from a horror story bared its teeth in a knowing smile. They were all alive, all trapped in their eternal narratives, just like I was trapped in mine. Then I saw something that made me drop the mirror in shock. In one of the reflections, I saw myself, not as I am now, but as I would be in 50 years. My body was made entirely of living text. My eyes were ink-filled voids, and stories flowed from my mouth like smoke. The mirror shattered when it hit the floor, and reality snapped back to what passes for normal in this place. But now I know what lies beneath the surface, what the library really is. It's not just a building that collects stories. It's a living archive of narrative energy, feeding off the imagination and emotions of everyone who reads within its walls. That knowledge changed how I saw my role as night librarian. I wasn't just a cursed victim or a supernatural security guard. I was becoming part of something vast and ancient, something that existed long before books were invented and would continue long after digital media replaced paper and ink. The library began showing me more of its secrets after that. I learned that each section had its own guardian spirit, former night librarians who had completed their terms and chosen to merge with their favorite genres. The romance section was watched over by a woman made of rose petals and teardrops. The mystery section had a shadow detective who helped readers find the perfect whodunit. And the horror section, well, some things are better left undescribed. I started noticing how the library influenced its daytime visitors in subtle ways. It would guide troubled teens to books that spoke to their struggles, lead grieving widows to stories of hope and renewal, show frustrated writers exactly the reference they needed. It wasn't all darkness and horror. The library genuinely seemed to care about its readers in its own alien way. But it was still dangerous. Like any powerful entity, it had its own agenda, its own needs, and it was getting hungrier. Last week I discovered why the library's hunger was growing. In one of Elizabeth Blackwood's later journals, she wrote about a cycle that occurs every 200 years, a time when the barrier between stories and reality grows dangerously thin. The last cycle was in 1824. The next one, 2024. This year. I started noticing the signs she described. Books rearranging themselves more frequently, characters slipping out of their stories at night, leaving blank pages behind, the black leather book appearing in multiple places simultaneously, and most disturbing of all, readers starting to show physical changes after spending too much time in certain sections. There was Mark, the grad student who practically lived in the history section. After a month of daily visits, his skin started developing sepia tones, and his clothes gradually transformed into different historical periods as he moved through the building. He didn't seem to notice, but other patrons did. I had to ban him from the library before he completely transformed into a living historical document. Then there was Jenny, a young romance novelist who wrote in the quiet study area. Her tears began turning to rose water, and her sighs caused love poems to appear in frost on the windows. The library was transforming her into a living muse. I caught her trying to merge with a bookshelf one evening, her body already half dissolved into paper and ink. I managed to save them both, temporarily at least. The library doesn't give up its chosen ones easily. But each rescue came with a price. Every time I interfered with the library's feeding, my own transformation accelerated. The words under my skin began moving faster, forming and reforming into new stories. My hair turned to fine strands of paper, my nails to tiny golden book plates. When I cry now, my tears leave ink stains on my cheeks. And sometimes, when I speak, other voices emerge. The voices of characters from every book I've ever read. But the worst part is the dreams. Every time I sleep, I dream I'm wandering through an endless library. Each book contains a different version of my life. Paths not taken, choices not made. In some, I never took the night librarian job. In others, I became something far worse than what I am now. And in a few, I found a way to break the curse. But those dreams always end before I can read how I did it. I've started writing my own story in the blank books that appear on my desk each morning. Not just recording what's happening, but actively trying to change the narrative. If the library feeds on stories, maybe I can feed it something that will change its hunger, alter its patterns. The other night librarians tried similar experiments. Samuel Chen, 1787 to 1837, attempted to write a story so boring it would put the library to sleep. The building responded by turning him into a living book of the most exciting adventures ever written. Maria Vasquez, 1737 to 1787, tried writing a story about a library that set its night librarian free. She disappeared into her own narrative, leaving behind only a single page that rewrote itself every time someone tried to read it. My approach is different. I'm writing the library's own story, trying to understand what it really is, why it needs us. The more I write, the more connections I see. The pattern of 50-year terms, the cycle of transformations, the way the library seems to be preparing for something. Something big is coming. I can feel it in the way the building hums with energy at night, how the books whisper more urgently, how the shadows move with greater purpose. The 200-year cycle isn't just about the barrier between stories and reality weakening. It's about something trying to break through. Last night, I found a hidden message encoded in the library's architectural plans. When viewed under ultraviolet light, the blueprints showed a different building, one with impossible geometries and rooms that couldn't exist in normal space. At the center was a chamber marked with a symbol I recognized from the black leather book. The symbol translated to, "The story that ends all stories." I think I finally understand what the library really is. It's not just collecting tales or trapping storytellers. It's building something. Each night librarian, each transformed reader, each absorbed story, we're all part of a larger narrative. A story so powerful it could rewrite reality itself. And the final chapter is about to begin. 3 days ago, I found a series of photographs hidden inside a hollowed-out book. They dated back to 1824, the last time the 200-year cycle peaked. The images were disturbing, not because of what they showed, but because of what they didn't. In each photo, there was a blank space where the library should have been, as if the building had temporarily stepped out of reality. But it was what I found behind the photos that really chilled me. Newspaper clippings reporting mass disappearances in Brighton Falls during that same week. 37 people vanished without a trace. All of them were last seen entering the library. The articles didn't mention that every missing person had been reading from the black leather book in the days before they vanished. I only know this because I found their names written in invisible ink on the library's ceiling, visible only at midnight when the moonlight hits just right. Yesterday, I caught a group of teenagers trying to break into the library after hours. They'd heard rumors about the paranormal investigator's disappearance and wanted to film a ghost hunting video for their YouTube channel. As I watched from the shadows, my skin crawling with warnings written in living ink, I saw the library respond to their presence. The front doorknob turned to warm brass under their touch. The security system inexplicably failed. Streetlights near the building flickered and died. The library was inviting them in. I tried to stop them. I really did. But the words caught in my throat, coming out as fragments of old stories instead of warnings. By the time I fought through the library's control, they were already inside, their flashlight beams bouncing off the walls like curious fingers. I followed them through the dark aisles, watching as the library began its performance. Books fell from shelves at just the right moments to lead them deeper inside. Shadows moved in ways that drew them toward the rare books room. Whispers echoed from nowhere, speaking their deepest desires. The black leather book was waiting for them, of course. It always is. But this time, something was different. The book had multiplied. 5 copies, one for each teenager. When they opened the books, each one showed them a different story. Their story, written in advance, telling them exactly how they would become part of the library forever. I watched in horror as they started reading aloud, their voices blending together in a chorus of doom. The air grew thick with floating letters. The walls began to pulse. Reality started to bend. And then I saw them, all the previous night librarians, materializing like ghosts made of paper and ink. They formed a circle around the teenagers, their mouths moving in silent recitation. Even Mr. Harrison was there, his form more solid than the others, a sad smile on his face. "The cycle is almost complete," he said, his voice rustling like turning pages. "When the barrier falls, all stories will become one. Reality and fiction will merge. The library will spread beyond these walls, transforming everything it touches. And you, Sarah, will help us make it happen." I watched in frozen horror as each teenager began to change. The first, a girl with dyed blue hair, gasped as her skin turned translucent like onion paper. Stories began writing themselves across her flesh. Not just any stories, but her own memories, hopes, and fears transforming into text before my eyes. The second teen started laughing uncontrollably as his fingers elongated into bookmark ribbons, spreading out to touch the nearest shelves. Where they connected, books began whispering his name. The third and fourth, twin brothers, merged with their copies of the Black Book simultaneously. Their screams turned to poetry as their bodies dissolved into chapters of a story that had never been told before. But it was the fifth teenager, a quiet boy named Alex, who showed me something new. Instead of transforming, he slammed his book shut and looked directly at me. His eyes were different, ancient, knowing. He wasn't just another victim. He was something else entirely. "You're close to understanding," he said, his voice carrying echoes of every story ever written. "But you still haven't read between the lines." The other night librarians moved closer, their paper forms rustling with anticipation. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, placing a hand on Alex's shoulder. His fingers left inky prints on the boy's jacket. "Show her," Harrison whispered. "Show her what the library really is." Alex raised his hand, and suddenly the library unfolded. The walls peeled back like pages in a pop-up book, revealing endless shelves stretching into infinity. But these shelves didn't hold books. They held realities. Each volume contained an entire universe, complete with its own laws of physics and alternate histories. "The library isn't collecting stories," Alex explained. "It's collecting possibilities. Every book ever written creates a new reality. Every reader who loses themselves in a story adds power to that reality. And every 50 years, when a night librarian completes their term, those realities grow stronger." He walked to a nearby shelf and pulled out a book that looked suspiciously familiar. "Your diary, Sarah. Every word you've written about your experiences here has been creating something new. A reality where libraries are portals between worlds, where stories have power, where imagination shapes truth." The other teenagers, now fully transformed into living text, began to flow up the walls, their words merging with the library's endless collection. But Alex remained unchanged, solid in a world that was becoming increasingly fluid. "The 200-year cycle isn't an ending," he continued. "It's a beginning, a chance to break down the walls between fiction and reality completely, to let imagination reshape the world. But it needs anchors, people like you, who understand both sides. Night librarians who can bridge the gap between what is and what could be." Mr. Harrison's form flickered like a candle flame. "We tried to tell you through the books, through the transformations, through the signs, but some things have to be experienced to be understood. The library isn't a prison, Sarah. It's an incubator. And you're not just its caretaker, you're its child." Suddenly, every book in the library opened simultaneously, their pages fluttering like wings. Stories poured out in rivers of living text, swirling around us in a tornado of tales. I saw my own story among them, still being written, still changing. "The choice was always yours," Alex said, holding out the black leather book. "Stay as you are, fighting a transformation you don't understand, or embrace what you're becoming and help us write the next chapter of reality itself." My skin was burning now, every word ever written trying to surface at once. The black leather book in Alex's hand seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. Questions exploded in my mind like fireworks. "If what you're saying is true," I managed to say, "then why the horror? Why the transformations? Why make it feel like a curse?" Alex smiled, but it was Mr. Harrison who answered, his paper-thin form rustling closer. "Fear opens minds. Terror breaks down the walls we build between reality and imagination. Every person who runs screaming from this building leaves changed, more aware of the possibilities lurking in shadows, more open to the magic of stories." "And the missing people? The ones who disappeared in 1824? Look around you," Alex said, gesturing to the infinite library that surrounded us. "They're not missing. They're exploring, living in the stories they always loved, creating new ones. Some are heroes in fantasy realms, others solve mysteries in noir landscapes. They're more alive now than they ever were in your limited reality." The transformed teenagers were proof of his words. I could see them floating through the cosmic library's endless shelves, their text bodies glowing with joy as they discovered worlds within worlds. They hadn't been trapped, they'd been freed. But something still didn't add up. "Who are you really, Alex? You're not just another teenager who wandered in here." He laughed, and the sound rippled through every book in every universe. "I've had many names. Some call me the first story. Others know me as the original word. I am the spark that taught humans to imagine, to dream, to create. And this library? It's not just a building in Brighton Falls. It's my body, my mind, my heart, extending through all realities, collecting the tales that give existence meaning. As if responding to his words, the library shuddered. Shelves rearranged themselves into impossible geometric patterns. Books flew from their places, forming constellations of narrative energy. And in the center of it all, the black leather book began to glow. The 200-year cycle, Alex continued, is when the barriers between stories are thinnest, when my true form can manifest most clearly. I choose these moments to find special people like you, Sarah, people who can help guide others through the transformation that's coming. What transformation? Mr. Harrison's ghost smiled, his inky tears leaving stains in the air. The next stage of human evolution. Stories aren't just entertainment, Sarah. They're practice for bigger things. Every time someone loses themselves in a book, they're learning to exist in multiple realities at once. Humanity is almost ready to take the next step, to become like us, creatures of pure narrative energy. The black leather book floated from Alex's hand to hover between us. Its pages opened, showing me everything. The complete truth of existence, the power of imagination to shape reality, the future that awaited if I accepted my role. The pages of the floating book showed me visions that broke and remade my understanding of reality. I saw libraries across the world, all connected, all part of the same vast organism, each one a portal, each one preparing for the moment when the walls between fiction and fact would dissolve completely. In New York, a night librarian like me watched over rows of books that contained living dreams. In Tokyo, a young girl discovered she could step into her favorite manga, her body turning to living ink. In London, an ancient reading room served as a birthing chamber for new realities. The horror stories, the transformations, the fear, they're not just about breaking down mental barriers, Alex explained, his form flickering between teenager and something much older, much vaster. They're vaccines, preparing humanity for a reality where anything is possible, where imagination and existence are the same thing. The black leather book's pages turned faster, showing me what would happen during this 200-year cycle. The changes wouldn't just affect the library anymore. They would spread, turning the whole world into a place where stories lived and breathed. But people will panic, I said, watching scenes of chaos as reality began to shift. They'll resist. Mr. Harrison floated closer, his form more solid than before. That's why we need guides, people who understand both worlds, night librarians who can help others embrace the transformation instead of fighting it. Show her, Alex commanded, and the book's pages blazed with new light. I saw myself as I could be, not just a night librarian, but a guardian of reality itself. My body made of living stories, able to shift between forms, helping others navigate the merge between fiction and fact. Not a cursed victim, but a chosen protector. The transformed teenagers swirled around me, their text bodies forming patterns that told new stories. They were enjoying their power, creating and exploring, free from the limitations of ordinary existence. This is what the library has been preparing you for, Alex said softly. Not just to watch over books, but to help birth a new age of human consciousness. Every story ever written has been leading to this moment. As if to emphasize his words, the entire building began to pulse with light. Books flew from their shelves, their pages opening to release clouds of living letters. The air itself seemed to turn to ink, swirling with the potential of infinite tales. "The choice is yours," Mr. Harrison said, extending his paper hand. "Fight what you're becoming and remain trapped between worlds, or embrace your transformation and help us guide humanity into a new chapter of existence." I looked down at my skin, watching the words shift and flow. Every story I'd ever read, every tale I'd ever loved, all of them were part of me now. And maybe that wasn't a curse at all. Maybe it was an evolution. Standing there, surrounded by infinite shelves and living stories, I realized something crucial. All my life, I'd been running from reality into books. But maybe that hadn't been an escape at all. Maybe it had been preparation. "If I accept," I said slowly, watching the words ripple across my skin. "What happens to the regular people? The ones who don't love stories like we do?" Alex's ancient eyes softened. "Not everyone will transform the same way. Some will become living stories, like your teenage friends here. Others will remain as they are, but able to see and interact with narrative realities. The world won't end, it will expand. Imagine a place where every story ever dreamed can be experienced, where imagination and reality dance together instead of fighting for dominance." Mr. Harrison's paper hand was still extended toward me. "Remember how it felt? That first time you lost yourself in a book so completely that the real world disappeared? That wasn't just reading. That was your first step into what humanity could become." The black leather book hovered closer, its pages showing me more possibilities. I saw children walking through walls into enchanted gardens, their laughter turning to musical notes that floated in the air. I watched business executives shape reality with well-chosen words, their presentations literally coming to life around them. I witnessed artists whose paintings opened into new worlds, scientists whose theories spawned alternate universes. But I also saw the darkness, people lost between stories, trapped in narratives they couldn't escape. Others driven mad by the ability to exist in multiple realities at once. Some who would use the power of living stories as weapons. "That's why we need you," Alex said, reading my concerns in the text flowing across my face. "The library chose you because you understand both the light and shadow of stories. You can help others find balance in a world where anything is possible." The building shuddered again, and I felt the approach of midnight. The 200-year cycle was reaching its peak. Soon, the barriers would begin to fall, ready or not. I looked at my reflection in a nearby window. My body was more text than flesh now, stories writing and rewriting themselves across my skin. My hair had become living poetry, flowing in winds from other worlds. And my eyes were windows into every book I'd ever read. But I wasn't a prisoner of the library anymore. I was becoming something else, something new. I reached for the black leather book with hands made of living words. As my fingers touched its cover, every story in existence seemed to hold its breath. The moment I touched the black leather book, reality fractured. The library walls dissolved into waterfalls of text, revealing the infinite cosmic library beyond. Every book in existence opened simultaneously, their stories pouring out like rivers of living light. "Remember," Alex said, his form shifting between human and something vast and ancient, "once you accept this, there's no going back. You'll be part of every story ever told and every story yet to come." I looked at the transformed teenagers, now dancing through the cosmic shelves like comets made of poetry. At Mr. Harrison, his paper form growing stronger as the barriers between realities weakened. At my own skin, where words swirled like galaxies of living ink. "Will it hurt?" I whispered. Alex smiled. "Like all the best stories do." I opened the black book. Light exploded from its pages, enveloping me in a tornado of text. Every story ever written poured into my mind at once. Every joy, every sorrow, every triumph and tragedy. I felt myself dissolving, my consciousness spreading across infinite narratives. I was every hero and villain, every beginning and ending. I lived countless lives in countless worlds. I died 1,000 deaths and was reborn in 1,000 different ways. And then, suddenly, I was myself again. But myself had become something much bigger than before. I could feel every library on Earth, all connected through threads of narrative energy. I could sense people reading, their minds creating new realities with every page turn. I could see the stories coming alive, seeping into the world like ink through paper. The change was starting. Already, fiction was bleeding into reality. In New York, dragons made of paper and ink soared between skyscrapers. In Tokyo, anime characters stepped out of screens to walk among crowds. In London, Shakespeare's characters performed on street corners, their soliloquies changing the weather. Some people ran screaming, others stood in awe. Many simply blinked and accepted it, as if they'd always known this day would come. "It's time," Alex said, extending his hand. "There will be chaos at first, fear, confusion. They'll need guides to help them understand, to show them how to navigate a world where imagination shapes reality." I took his hand, feeling the power of the first story flow through me. My transformation was complete now. I wasn't just a night librarian anymore. I was a guardian of stories, a protector of the space where reality and fiction merge. The teenagers swirled around us, their text bodies forming words in the air. What happens next? I smiled, watching as the sun rose over a world forever changed. We write the next chapter together. But there's something I haven't told you yet, dear viewer. Something important. As I speak these words into my camera, sharing this story with you, the 200-year cycle is still in progress. The barriers are still falling. And that black leather book? It's not just in Brighton Falls anymore. Check your local library. Look for a book that seems to appear and disappear at random. One that calls to you in a voice like rustling pages. One that promises to make you part of a story bigger than yourself. But be careful what you read. Because in a world where stories come alive, every choice has consequences. Every page turn could be a doorway. Every word could be a transformation waiting to happen. The question isn't whether you'll become part of the story. The question is, which story will you become? If this story kept you awake, hit that subscribe button for more true horror stories. Drop a comment below, letting me know where you're watching from. Who knows, your local library might be next. Sleep tight if you dare.